Golden. I'm Lily, and we're here with Laura Lam today.
So I had 2 books come out during lockdown, which was super fun. So the first is Goldilocks, which stars the first all-female astronaut team who steal a spaceship to journey to Cavendish with the hope of creating a better world. And you'll find out whether or not they do in the book. And then I also wrote Seven Devils, which is co-written with Elizabeth May, and that's basically like Star Wars, but with more women and more gay and more murder. So that was fun. And then I've got other books like False Hearts and Shattered Minds and the Micah Gray trilogy. So plenty to find ideally somewhere other than that company named after a big river online. But your local independent bookstore would be a great place to find them. And I do signed copies for Transreal Books in Edinburgh, but pretty much any Edinburgh.
Have any depictions of utopias or utopian thinking inspired your work?
I think, sadly, mostly it's been the opposite. Like, I've read a lot of dystopians growing up. So I read, like 1984 and Brave New World. And then I kind of branched off into We by Yevgeny Zamyatin, which was written before, and he got kicked out of Russia for writing it. It's quite a good book, actually. And I read a lot of like young adult dystopian literature, but I think like the main utopia I remember from my childhood is probably Star Trek, because that was like a post-scarcity society and their main goal was exploration but not conquest, which was nice. So that was probably my main kind of reference point growing up. And I keep wishing I could be more utopian in my own work, but it tends to go a bit dystopian despite my best intentions. But I am kind of writing like a secondary world now, which is not remotely science fiction, but it's got a lot more utopian elements. Still terrible things, but it's at least like a queer norm world where you don't assume people's gender when you meet them, which I think would be nice in the utopia of the future.
One book I read recently that does gender interesting like that was Anne Leckie's book.
Oh yeah, Ancillary Justice. I did an event with her in May when Goldilocks came out, and I was just trying not to like fangirl. Yeah. Same with Becky Chambers, I think gets pretty close to utopia in her Wayfarers series as well. There's still things that go wrong, but you end that book, or each book of the series, just feeling very like happy and hopeful about the state of humanity, which is nice.
Yeah, they're quite like warm stories, and like connections between the characters are quite warm and emotional.
Yeah, they're lovely.
I think people often overlook Star Trek when it comes to the whole utopian thinking thing, because it's not often that they sort of pan back to Earth and like go and just hang about. But I mean, it is a proper post-scarcity society. It's all done with bartering. It's just when they go out into space that things go a little bit bonkers.
Yeah.
Borg and all that.
Yeah, and I think that's why they have to go out, because the problem with utopias in terms of storytelling is that you don't have as much conflict, and conflict is what generates story. So I think that's why we see less of them, along with perhaps humanity being a bit pessimistic sometimes.
Often in dystopias and even in some utopias, there's massive corporations, and it's they feature in your books as well. So assuming that capitalism doesn't die, because if you have a corporation, you have to assume there's some sort of capitalistic intent behind it. In your visions of the future, do you think it will be run by a centralized, large, sort of benevolent corporation that has the resources to fix all the problems, or do you think it will be more of a decentralized, scattered approach where everything's more like hyper-local?
I think like benevolent corporation is a slight oxymoron in terms, because I think the problem with our current mode of capitalism is that like profit is king, and like we're all, all corporations just worship at the altar of profit and increasing profits for shareholders at the expense of their workers. So like all those profits are really, especially I think we've seen over the past year, like stolen wages from workers. And so I don't think in our current way that we have capitalism it would work. Maybe if we had a more like actual structured or limited form of capitalism, where if there was a minimum wage, which was an actual living wage, we also had a maximum wage. And then like if I saw it online somewhere where it was like, if you become a billionaire, you get a trophy that says, congratulations, you won capitalism, and you can't get any more money. And all the money you make beyond that just goes to the common good. And I think like, if I became a billionaire, somehow I would survive on my like 100, I don't even know how many millions it is. It's either 100 or 1,000 million.
All those statistics really stagger me when people say if you were born like on the same day as Jesus and earned 30 grand a day and never spent a penny, you would still not be a billionaire today.
Yeah.
You know,
So I think
like
like humans, we can't quite grasp just how much money is being like sat on by these ultra billionaires, and they're just like dragons sitting. I mean, I guess a lot of the money is not real money. People always say it's just like this paper imaginary stuff in stock or whatever. But it could still, at least some of it could be, you know, converted into actual things that could help. So yeah, so I don't think with current free reign capitalism, I think we're just going to doom ourselves. But if we could find a way to kind of rein it in, then perhaps. And I suppose we've never really had like proper communism in a society. It's always kind of been like twisted for, you know, certain people trying to make lives better for themselves or to use it as power. So I don't know if we could, you know, actually have something like true socialism or communism like in Star Trek, but that would be interesting to experiment. And then I suppose too, like, I think in this increasingly digital age, we're either going to have way more borders or way less borders. And it's a bit unclear which way it's going to go. Like maybe we'll end up having more kind of like city-states, like in Greece, where they have full autonomy but are very good at working together. Or who knows?
It's like Malka Older's Infomocracy world, where everything is broken down into groups of 100,000, which is meant to be the ideal number of people for a democracy.
Yeah.
So that went into, there's obviously millions of borders at that point. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and Hold Back the Stars by Katie Kahn is like a space book that's been developed. It's being developed into film, I think, with John Boyega, which will be cool. And it has like basically a society where you kind of move to a different part of the world every now and again. So like you don't really feel like you're a citizen of a certain place. You're just, you know, a citizen of the world, and you kind of move around, which I thought was interesting as well. And it probably gives an attempt at utopia in that book as well.
In your book Goldilocks, the group of main characters want to develop a more utopian society on the planet Cavendish. Do you think that we have a good chance of building utopia with this kind of small group of experts, or will human traits prevent this?
So I chose the name Cavendish very deliberately. It's a reference to Margaret Cavendish, who wrote The Blazing World, which was like the first proto-science fiction novel even before Mary Shelley in 1666. And it was supposedly a utopia where like a woman from a world that's kind of like ours, but I guess not ours, goes to another world through the North Pole, and it's full of like birdmen and lizard men and talking animals, and she becomes empress of them all, and then decides to like invade her homeland with these people. I think like for the goal of creating a utopia, but she felt like monarchy was the only way to have a true utopia because it would stop power grasping, supposedly, which I wasn't sure I bought. But it was a really interesting read because it was also long before like a novel was a form, so it went off on all these philosophical digressions. But I think like basically her idea of utopia was colonialism. So that was a sort of deliberate nod, I think, to certain people's approaches for Cavendish, the planet. I don't want to give too much away, but they had all these lofty goals, and I think humanity is very good at making lofty goals, but less great at executing them in a way that doesn't cause harm.
We've said before in other interviews that one person's utopia is another person's hellscape. You know, colonialism would feel like a utopia if you're in 17th century England when it was all going quite well.
Something I thought about too when I was researching the book is the idea that like even if there is no like humans or animals on that planet, there's still like bacteria. And you know, you setting foot on even Mars has changed Mars because there's now these things scattered about that weren't there before, and you don't really know how like the bacteria in your gut biome would interact with bacteria on a new planet, or you know, if you start growing corn, is it going to be this huge invasive species? So it's also this idea not even of colonizing people, but colonizing a planet or colonizing a body.
That was in a book that we both read recently.
Is it the Sparrow?
The Sparrow. Yeah. They were really cautious about introducing any new species because as soon as you put something in the ground, you've got no idea where that's going to go or what that's going to change in the long run. I also saw there was lots of people on Twitter complaining about the Alien Covenant the other day. I think it was shown on TV or something. And there's a bit where they visit a new planet and they all just step off the spaceship like without helmets on or anything.
Oh yeah, when they took off the helmets, I was like, this is not good science.
No,
I'm not even a scientist.
Yeah.
And like sticking their face like against the thing, and then of course you're gonna die.
Have they not learned anything from like, the previous like 6 Alien films? Don't stick your face near anything. There'll be one of those jumpy spider guys that's going to get you. So, anyway, that's stupid. I haven't even seen the film and already I'm annoyed at it. So.
Yeah, I was really annoyed at it.
Maybe it's just
There was a really good film somewhere in there. It just didn't manifest. But
yeah. Virtual reality and augmented reality technologies are improving all the time, and they're becoming far more ubiquitous in new developments and architecture and retail experiences, that kind of thing. What part do you think these sort of new virtual and augmented realities will play in society moving forward, and could they be used for any kind of utopian purposes?
So me and my partner Sinead were talking about this because we're working together on a YouTube project called Sci-Utopia, which looks at creating 2 different versions of 2050 where both of them have hit their target carbon emissions. We'll still have extreme weather because we're just locked into that now. But one of them has gone about it in more equitable, more utopian ways, and one in less equitable, more dystopian ways. So we call them carrot and stick because it made us laugh. And so we were kind of doing like a timeline of what are the big kind of scientific breakthroughs that need to happen by the time we're even at 2050 in both the worlds. So we really need to have carbon neutral fertilizer and a way to have like concrete that's carbon neutral and that sort of thing, because all the green walls outside of a building are not actually carbon neutral when you're still building out of concrete. And we were thinking about like virtual reality and how that's going to get much, much better and much more immersive, to the point where like you might decide to just travel the world via VR because it's a lot less hassle than having to like buy a ticket to Paris and like fly the plane and take the taxi from the airport and pay for the hotel and see the grimy bits of Paris instead of the pretty bits of Paris. Or trying to get to the actual Amazon rainforest is a huge headache because you have to get all the vaccinations and get a permit. So it might be easier to just instantly be able to camp in the Amazon rainforest for a week and not get bitten to death by mosquitoes. I would probably sooner do that. And that would result in less air travel, which is really important for climate change. And I think it could also maybe do a good, like it could foster a lot of empathy if you could be like, okay, what is it like for someone in a really, still developing country that's, really challenging? What does it actually look like to live in their village? And maybe that would help, inspire people to actually do good and help them continue developing, or things like that. I guess there's still the danger that if you're putting kind of a filter on, say, Paris, like we're putting filters on our faces on selfies and stuff, then maybe that's also a problem. But I think on the whole, it could do a lot of really interesting things. Plus you could have cool alien worlds, which I would go to.
I think the thing that I couldn't give up though was the food. If I go somewhere I want to try out local things, I think that's what I would miss the most.
I'm sure there could be a way to like partner with some like new travel agency that would like deliver the food to your door. So and be like, yes, I will have this Ethiopian food feast today, or whatever.
Or maybe they'll be able to make 3D printers that can print food.
Yeah.
And you could put in like Ethiopian cuisine, and it would just print a load of that, and you'd have that while you've got your
Yeah. There we go.
Sounds amazing.
Yeah.
I'm really into this now. Let's make this happen. Let's stop being musicians. Let's invent.
It might be a bit harder than music. You mentioned in VR how like we filter ourselves and things. So I'd like to know more about what you think about the future of body modification. So in Shattered Minds, as well as technology being used to manipulate people's minds, people can also go to flesh parlours where they can change their physical appearance. Do you see body modification as being a bigger part of our futures, and in what ways can it benefit society?
Yeah, I think like the obvious way it can benefit society, I think, is like transitioning is pretty much hacking your hormones. And in Shattered Minds and False Hearts, like I think a utopian part of the otherwise dystopian surveillance state is that like it's very easy to just, change your hormones or physically transition. It's affordable. There's, you probably would have to go through a couple of steps, but it wouldn't be near as dehumanizing as the current process is with the wait lists and things like that. So I think that's a definite plus for the future. But I think in general, like just more body autonomy could be interesting. I think there's still things to to worry about. But, you know, I think even in current society, things like plastic surgery are becoming a lot less destigmatized, especially ones that are like more temporary, like fillers in your face. Like, I have no interest in it, but I think it's cool how you can inject something and change the shape of your jaw or your nose or whatever. So I think that might become more commonplace. And I suppose something I'm interested but a bit nervous about are things like neurohacking or nootropics, like the Silicon Valley dude bros are really into. On the one hand, it would be nice to have something that would help you concentrate easier, especially like in pandemic land. We were talking earlier about how like concentration is just really hard right now. So if there was a way to do that gently to get more work done, that would be nice. Or, you know, I suppose there could be new breakthroughs and treatments for anxiety or depression or things like that too. So I think we'll start seeing more body modifications and kind of body hacking. We're already seeing like cyberpunk aficionados like injecting or implanting things under their skin so they can like unlock doors with a wave of their hand, which I basically had as Very chips in Pacifica and Shattered Minds. So it's weird to kind of see like the stuff you put in science fiction novels just kind of starting to trickle into the real world, but in a way you didn't quite expect. So it makes you feel like, yes, I predicted the future. But then sometimes you're like, oh no, I predicted the future.
I would really love that sort of chip thing, because a number of times I've left without my keys, or I lose my phone or anything along those lines. I can't lose a hand, you know, or
I mean,
if I did, I'd have much bigger concerns if I lost a hand. So. Yeah. I'd be up for that.
Just attach everything to your body so you can't lose it. So your wallet, your keys, and your phone, or just on your body.
But then they can track you at any time. Well, though they pretty much can already track you with your phone. So.
Yeah.
You've already given that away.
Yeah.
If it was like a Swiss Army hand, if you could just like flick it out, and then there's like a phone and a wallet and like cutlery as well. You know, like a fork. You know.
Yeah.
Fork. A spork. Yeah. Come on. Let's be efficient.
A straw, so that you don't have to worry about the straws in the ocean.
Yeah. So we mentioned at the start that. You've been influenced more by dystopias and utopias, and there's just generally more of them. Do you think that writing more about utopias would be a positive step as an aspirational kind of thing, or is it important to keep writing about dystopias as more of a warning?
I think like both is good. You know, that meme from El Dorado, because I think like utopia, I think at the end of the day is a dream. Like, I don't think you can actually get a real utopia because it literally means no place, right? But I think you can be at different parts along the path. So like a dystopia is over here and a more utopian is over here. But I don't know if you'll ever get to a complete dystopia. Even the worst ones will have some glimmer of hope, or, you know, people looking out for each other. You see a lot in like disaster films and dystopia. Like sometimes you will see humanity is still good, although ultimately also bad, but usually good. And in utopia too, like as we said, one person's utopia is usually at the expense of someone else's. So like living in the Capitol in the Hunger Games, probably pretty great, but then there's the Hunger Games. So it's more about like your personality or your distribution of it. Like I really love that William Gibson quote, "The future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed." And so I think that's really interesting to pick apart and look at in fiction. And I think like if you can find a way to do a utopia and still generate enough conflict to have a story, like I would love to read more books that do just kind of feel like a hug, and you know close the book and you're like, yes, humanity is good, hooray. So I keep trying to write them and then they go sideways. So eventually I'll manage it.
These depictions of utopian and dystopian societies, what influence do you think science fiction can have on contemporary society, whether it is utopia or dystopia?
Yeah, I think it's like we wrote about going to the moon before we went to the moon, and we wrote a lot about Mars, and I think a lot of that is fueling our current, desire to go to Mars. But like we talked about with benevolent corporations, at present, it seems like if we do get to Mars, it's going back to a feudal society with indentured servants, and Elon Musk is our overlord. which does not seem like utopia to me. And also, even if we could get Mars to be society-wise a utopia, to start with, we're all going to have to live in underground bunkers with no windows, which is like quarantine forever, except with no sunshine, which also is not a utopia for me. So I think like utopia can show us all these different visions and potential futures for better or worse to kind of help us, you know, think about what we actually want in society, but then it's, you know, up to us to actually do it. But even though we may never actually get to utopia, I think it's still worth like going along that never-ending path and getting a little closer, because what all utopias have in common is this idea of true equality and true justice and, you know, freedom and, you know, looking after people and making sure no one falls through the cracks. And I think that's definitely a worthy goal that society should never give up on.
Yeah, and even the steps on the way are like incremental improvements. So even if the like ideal is never reached, each step is better.
Yeah, I mean, society now is way better than the Middle Ages. I've been doing a lot of research of that for my secondary fantasy, and I'm like so glad I did not live in the Middle Ages, where life expectancy was like 45.
So we've asked the other interviewees this as well, and it's an awkward question, because we want to ask, what does a utopia look like to you? And if you could make one change to society or the world right now, whether it's big or small, what would it be to get you a little bit closer to that idea of utopia?
That's a good question. I think it would probably be like eat the rich or tax the rich to high heaven, really, because I think once we had access to those resources, then we could, you know, make sure and make improvements in, you know, social care, and we could really look at, I think we also, as a second point, really need to look at reforming the criminal justice system and police, because as we've seen, it's not doing well, and the fact that we have for-profit prisons in America is just like baffling to me. And that documentary 13th really drove that home. I learned a lot that I didn't know about like my own home country. So I think those would be my two things. Steal all the money back, get out the, like, don't have to have literal guillotines, but you know, we can topple them off. Evidently the separation of wealth is like greater now than it was just before the French Revolution. So that is pretty incredible when you think about that. So yeah, steal it back from the rich. It's our money, really. They just stole our wages and our productivity. So
You can't steal what wasn't theirs to take.
yeah.
You know, I like all the protests in France that you see, because occasionally they'll build a guillotine and like take up to a town hall. You think, good God, you're not fucking around. So I admire their ambition, but lads, let's maybe just let's tone it down a little bit.
Yeah, we don't need another reign of terror, but I do think like we need to do something, because people's patience is really wearing thin. And I think the pandemic has really shown the cracks in various systems. And so if you want to stop this increased inequality, on the one hand, but on the other hand too, we've now seen that the government can just give you money if it wants to. So I think that's sort of the thin edge of the wedge of things like basic universal income, which will be really useful, or, you know, having just a proper living wage. And yeah, so I think in order to combat climate change, it's like we have to have the Industrial Revolution and intersectional science fiction and the French Revolution like put in a blender, and it has to happen in the next 30 years. So it's very exciting, but it's very scary.
I love that quote.
It's kind of, it feels like it's a race to the bottom. Like, what's going to happen first? Are people going to snap and demand change, or will our collective willpower just be worn down to a point where we don't complain anymore?
There's a lot of apathy, and I think that's what most scared me about my cyberpunks, False Hearts and Shattered Minds, is I put in that like if you give them enough pretty shiny things, that people will just willfully look away from the darkness, because it's just easier to distract yourself with the shiny things. And I think that's what scares me most about society, is if we just shrug while things get worse, or just like give them our privacy because we want the shiny thing, the cool new tech or whatever, the VR tech perhaps.